Napoleon's invasion of Russia in 1812 is considered one of the greatest blunders in military history. Even though the French emperor had defeated most of Europe's armies, he was unable to conquer Russia despite having superior numbers and firepower. So why did Napoleon invade Russia in the first place? Let's find out. A lot has been said about Napoleon's decision to invade Russia in June 1812, but most people are wrong about the reason for this fatal mistake. While some say that Napoleon wanted to force the Russians to join the Continental System, which closed European ports to British goods, others claim that it was his desire to conquer the vast Russian Empire, or even his ambition to take over all of Europe that led him to invade the nation. However, these claims are far from the truth. In fact, Napoleon didn't want to invade Russia at all. He only decided to do so because he believed that it would be an easy task. His plan was to get into Russia quickly, force the Russians to sign a treaty, and then go back to France before winter without any major engagements. But how could he be so sure that such a big army could just waltz into Russia and come back in a few months? It all had to do with a miscalculation. And what Napoleon got wrong was the distance between France and Moscow. You see, Napoleon thought that Russia wasn't that far away from France. In fact, he estimated that the distance was only around 800 leagues. To put it in perspective, a league was a unit of distance used during medieval times equal to about 3 miles. Therefore, Napoleon thought that 800 leagues would mean that Russia was around 2,400 miles away from France. But that was very wrong. It's true that there are many ways to measure the distance between two places, but if we take the straight line between Paris and Moscow, we will see that the distance is close to 1,600 miles. And this is where Napoleon went wrong. You see, while studying at the military academy in France, he had learned that the distance from Paris to Moscow was 800 leagues, or 2,400 miles. But the map that he studied was not accurate. The map in question was created by a man named Gerardus Mercator, who was a Flemish geographer, cartographer, and astronomer. He invented the Mercator projection, which is still used today by sailors and pilots. The projection makes some countries larger and others smaller to make the world look more compact. This is also why the United States looks as big as Brazil on a map when we know that it's much smaller. But anyway, the map isn't entirely inaccurate, it just has some distortions. For example, Mercator's map shows the distance from Paris to Moscow as 800 leagues, but the real distance is closer to 1,600 miles. The problem was that there were no other maps available at the time that showed the real distance. Napoleon had access to Mercator's map just like everyone else. So he based his plans on that map, thinking that Russia wasn't that far away. But this miscalculation would have devastating consequences for the future of Europe. Before we move on, let me ask you this. Do you think that Napoleon would have invaded Russia if he knew that it was 1,600 miles away instead of 800? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. As we have already mentioned, the real distance between Paris and Moscow is around 1,600 miles. But since Napoleon thought that it was only 800 miles, he planned to reach Moscow within 3 weeks. With that distance, his army wouldn't have to hurry. They could move at their own pace, stop for supplies, and take a break whenever they needed to. In fact, Napoleon didn't even plan to fight on the way to Moscow. He wanted to avoid a long war with Russia, so he didn't want to waste time and resources destroying the Russian army. His plan was to get into Russia, force the Russians to sign a peace treaty, and then go back home. As I said, simple, easy, and effective. But unfortunately, Napoleon's army didn't move as fast as he thought they would. While it would take about 3 weeks to travel the 800 miles that he expected, the distance between France and Moscow was much longer. The Grand Army moved slowly and steadily eastward, but after a month they hadn't even reached Poland yet. This made Napoleon anxious because he started to realize that his calculations might have been wrong. On July, after receiving reports that his army was moving too slowly, he wrote, "We are only half through our journey and I feel as though we at the end of it." From that point on, he ordered his generals to speed up the march to Moscow. But this caused many problems for the soldiers. Many of them had to abandon their artillery and wagons in order to move faster. They lived off the land, stealing food from Russian villages. and eventually they were forced to sleep outdoors even though it was already August and the weather was starting to turn cold. And even after all this, the French army kept moving slowly. By September, Napoleon's troops had reached Belarus, which is closer to Russia than France. But even then, his army was exhausted and demoralized. There were only two choices at this point. Either return to France and admit defeat or continue to Moscow and try to win a quick battle before winter arrived. Napoleon chose the second option, and that led him right into one of the biggest traps in military history. Ever since Napoleon entered Russia, he had been plagued by the lack of supplies. Most of his soldiers didn't carry any food, so they had to steal from the locals or die of hunger. And that made the French emperor extremely unpopular in Russia. His decision to burn entire villages to the ground also contributed to that. But whatever resentment the Russians felt towards Napoleon turned into full-blown hatred when he took this step. When Napoleon's army finally reached Moscow in October, they found an empty city. The Russians had abandoned the capital and fled. They had known about Napoleon's plan to invade Russia for months, so they had enough time to prepare. For example, Kutuzov, the commander of the Russian army, had been preparing for Napoleon's arrival since 1811. At the time, he was stationed near Kiev and had spent a year gathering troops and weapons. But even though Kutuzov was prepared, his army wasn't able to stop Napoleon from entering Russia. In fact, Napoleon had won several battles against them. But that doesn't mean that the Russians weren't winning the war. Kutuzov knew that Napoleon would eventually enter Moscow, so he avoided fighting him until his army was ready. Meanwhile, he sent messengers to the rest of Russia telling people to flee the cities and move to the countryside. He also gave orders to destroy everything that could be useful for Napoleon's army, including food supplies, factories, bridges, and roads. In the end, Kutuzov's strategy paid off. Napoleon was forced to retreat from Moscow in October. His army was decimated by cold, starvation, and disease. Only a few weeks later, Kutuzov's forces attacked the weakened French army. They didn't stand a chance. Within a few days, Napoleon had lost more than half of his troops. From that point on, the French emperor never recovered. The war in Russia completely destroyed his reputation as an invincible general. And as we said before, he only invaded Russia because he thought that it was close to France. Had he known the real distance, he would have never attempted to invade the country. But now we would like to hear from you. What do you think Napoleon would have done differently if he knew the real distance between France and Russia? Also, do you think that Napoleon could have won the war if he had more time to prepare? Thank you for watching.